Here we're going to be looking at the process by which capitalist economies come to equilibrium in the Keynesian model. And I want you to pay close attention to how Keynes and the Keynesians, or post-Keynesians rather, contrast with the neoclassical approach to the same question of equilibrium. We'll start here by defining equilibrium, and you'll see that this largely lines up with how we've treated it in the neoclassical version as well. Equilibrium, which we could denote with a Y sub E, output and income, sub E for equilibrium, occurs when planned expenditures, total spending, or aggregates demand is equal to output and income. So aggregates demand, AD, is equal to output and income, Y. This is just to say that when total money households spend and firms plan to spend is equal to how much is actually produced, the economy should be in equilibrium. There are other ways of looking at this as well. The amount that firms expected to sell equals the amounts they actually sell. This should constitute equilibrium. Another way of looking at it, actual inventory investments by businesses equals planned inventory investments, which is just another way of saying there are no unplanned inventory investments up or down. Also, we could say income not spent on consumption, which is to say money saved, is exactly offset by income injected in by investment or intended investments. Easiest way to look at this, though, is equilibrium occurs where intended spending, aggregates demand, is equal to actual output and income. And this definition is true whether we're talking about equilibrium from the neoclassical perspective or the post-Keynesian perspective. The equilibrium conditions are the same. What differs is how the economy gets to equilibrium. And just to review, before we look at Keynes's arguments, I want you to pause the video and ask yourself, in the neoclassical framework that we've studied previously, what are the mechanisms by which the economy adjusts to equilibrate where aggregates demand is equal to outputs and income? In the neoclassical framework, capitalism is all about price adjustments. If there's unemployment, wages should come down to increase demand for workers and decrease supply of workers, people who don't want to work at lower wages. If there's too little or too much money saved relative to investment, interest rates should adjust. The price of loanable funds should adjust in the loanable funds markets. Keynes rejected both of these arguments. We'll return to the loanable funds market later on in the term. For now, consider the absurdity of a nationwide wage cut in the middle of a recession. Would we really expect to see more hiring? I'm guessing your intuition is correct in finding that in recessionary periods where output and income is dropping, people are getting laid off, firms aren't selling what they had hoped to sell, and so forth, then a scenario in which workers across the country see a pay cut is probably not going to help things. In fact, it's probably going to make things worse because those people with lower incomes are now going to spend less money, which means for businesses, fewer sales. Most firms in this situation are going to say, yeah, well, it's cheaper to hire more workers, but since I'm not selling anything, it still doesn't make any sense to hire them. Now, what Keynes and many other heterodox economists are realizing 100 or so years ago is that in modern capitalist economies, adjustments aren't really made through prices. They're made through quantities. And this is the basic distinction between Keynes and the neoclassical economists. According to Keynes, the economy doesn't equilibrate through prices, but through changes in output and therefore income. So let's move then to the equilibrating process in the Keynesian or post-Keynesian model. Now, if equilibrium is defined where aggregates demand is equal to output and income, or AD equals Y, then there are two disequilibrium scenarios. One is where aggregates demand is less than output and income. That is, there was too little spending, or you could define that as too much output. The other is where aggregates demand is greater than output and income. There was too much spending or too little output, however you like to look at that. Let's look at each of these scenarios and see how the economy would return to equilibrium according to Keynes. In the first scenario, we're looking at too little spending. Aggregates demand is less than output and income. In this case, firms have inventories that are rising beyond what they were expecting, and actual inventory investment then is greater than planned inventory investments. How will firms respond to this? Well, if you see your inventory is rising and you don't want them to, the first and obvious response is to decrease outputs. If you're decreasing outputs, you're probably going to have workers that you don't need anymore and you're going to lay them off. This decreases income, which decreases consumption as well as savings in the economy as a whole. Just for a check, what tells us by how much consumption spending will decrease with a loss of income? If you said the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC, then you are correct. So let's look at this through our output income spending flow diagram. You have some amount of output which produces an equal amount of income. Both of these are denoted with Y. That then goes to the consumption function, telling us how much consumption spending will be done with that level of income. The savings function then tells us how much savings will be done depending on the level of income Y here. An amount of investments then totals the aggregates demand. And in this scenario, we're looking at a case in which aggregates demand is less than output and income. There's too much output relative to the level of spending in the economy as a whole. In this case, firms respond by cutting back production, laying off workers, which decreases output and by definition decreases income by an equal amount. With less income, then, households consume less, but they also save less. The MPC tells us how much less consumption is going to happen with every dollar of lost income, and the MPS tells us how much savings is going to be lost with every dollar of lost income as well. The drop in consumption spending then, of course, leads to a drop in aggregates demand. For our purposes here, we're going to assume that intended investment doesn't change, but the drop in consumption in any case should lead to a decline in aggregates demand. Notice what's happened is output, income, and spending have all decreased, but output and income have decreased by more than spending. Why do you think that is? The reason is because some of the income that was lost was being saved anyways, so that the total drop in spending with a drop in output and income is going to be less according to the MPC. So we're still at a point where aggregates demand is less than output and income. This is going to lead to further reductions in output and employment and income, which will lead to further reductions in consumption, but also in savings, leading to further reductions in spending. And this will continue to cycle through until the level of output and income decreases enough so that aggregates demand comes into line, is equal to, again, with output and income. All of this works essentially in reverse in the other scenario of disequilibrium, where aggregates demand is less than output and income. In this case, firms will see inventories fall by more than planned, which is to say actual inventory investment will be less than firms planned. Firms respond then by increasing outputs and hiring more people. This increases income in the economy, which increases both consumption and savings. Now, to return to that first scenario, though, again, back where aggregates demand is less than output and income, I want to look at this another way. As workers were being laid off, they lost their income and total money saved in the economy decreased. Recall that for the economy to be in equilibrium, money saved has to be offset by investments, dollar for dollar. That was true in the neoclassical system, and it's true here in the Keynesian or post-Keynesian framework as well. So what's happening here, another way of looking at this, is when there's too little spending, aggregates demand is less than output and income, layoffs are decreasing income so that savings shrink to meet investments. But you might be asking, if the economy is simply adjusting savings to equal investment, then isn't this the same as Say's law and the loanable funds approach we saw with the neoclassical framework? And the answer to that is not quite. In the neoclassical loanable funds model, interest rates adjust so that change in savings will change intended investment until the two are equal. Savings determines investment via the interest rates, the price mechanism in the loanable funds market. Whereas according to Keynes, a change in intended investment will change output and income, which will then change savings. Investment in Keynes's model is determining savings via adjustments in output and income, not interest rates. In a sense, what Keynes has done here is he's reversed the causality of savings being equal to intended investment. In the neoclassical model, savings becomes the money that then becomes investment. In Keynes's model, investment becomes the production, which becomes the employment, which becomes the income that can then be saved. So this brings us to a related question of what drives the economy, what actually drives the level of output and income, and therefore what drives the business cycle, fluctuations in the level of output and income. Now, if we assume autonomous consumption is constant and the MPC is stable, then consumption, that consumption function we've been working with really, is just reacting to changes in income. In that case, then, investment is the real driving force behind aggregates demand, and changes in investment really drive the business cycle. If Keynes was right about this, then we should expect to see a couple of things. First, we should expect greater volatility in investment spending than we see in consumption spending and GDP and output and income as a whole. And second, we should expect to see investment upswings being pro-cyclical. Easy way of looking at that is we should expect to see in recessions generally large drops in investment spending, and this is exactly what we see. Here in the red, you've got percent change from a year ago GDP, output and income for the American economy. You can see that generally GDP increases by a relatively stable amount, although there are periods, these recessionary periods, where we don't see the same level of growth. Usually also see a negative dip or a dip into the negative territory, GDP actually shrinking. Consumption expenditures are also fairly stable, usually growing over time as the economy grows over time. It's investments, real gross private domestic investment, businesses making investment decisions where we see the volatility. Year over year, sometimes 10, 20, 30, even 40% changes in investment spending across the economy. And of course, we can see that it tends to be pro-cyclical. We see wild swings downward generally in recessionary periods of that investment spending. So a cursory look at the empirical evidence suggests that Keynes was onto something here. Volatility in GDP in the economy in general does appear to be led or driven by volatility in private business investments. So the last couple of questions I want to address here then is, if aggregate demand determines output and employment, does the fact that savings equals investment ensure full employment? Not according to Keynes. Savings merely adjust to whatever level of income aggregate demand determines. Again, Keynes argued that demand drives supply. That supply is referring to outputs and income, and out of that income is the savings that people have the opportunity to accumulate. Second question, how does a free market, a capitalist economy, in the absence of government intervention, ensure that aggregate spending is going to be adequate to ensure full employment? According to Keynes, it simply doesn't.